Explain to me how someone like you affords a brand new Escalade.
The same way anyone does, Sheriff.
Rides like this don't come from honest work in my experience.
Sheriff, I am standing in front of you in a United States Navy uniform. Look at what is on my chest.
Anyone can buy a uniform online.
Is that really the hill you want to die on?
She had earned every decoration on that uniform. Not in a classroom, not behind a desk. In water so cold it shuts down the body's ability to reason, on beaches that grind skin from bone, in training so deliberately designed to break a person that only a fraction of those who begin it ever finish. She had finished it. She had been one of the first women in American history to do so, to complete basic underwater demolition/SEAL training, to earn the Trident, to put on a uniform that the United States Navy had spent decades telling women they could not wear. She was wearing it now. Standing outside a gas station on Highway 9 in Crestwood, Texas, at 4:47 in the afternoon, Mia, with a sheriff's patrol vehicle parked diagonally behind her Escalade, and a man who had been wearing a badge for 16 years asking her how someone like her could afford a brand new SUV. She had an answer for that. She had always had an answer for that. The Escalade had cost $68,000. She had paid cash, not all at once, but in the particular way that someone pays for something they have decided they are going to have, regardless of how long it takes. Direct deposits from 15 years of military service. Deployment pay, hazard pay. The accumulated financial discipline of a woman who had learned, in training and in the field, and in every room she had walked into, where people looked at her and made a calculation before she opened her mouth, that the only person responsible for her position in this world was herself. She had walked into this gas station for the same reason she had walked into it a dozen times before. It was on her route. It was clean. The pumps worked. She had pulled in at 4:41, inserted her credit card, placed the fuel nozzle in the tank, and was standing at the pump watching the gallon counter climb when she noticed the shadow cross the asphalt in front of her. She looked up. Sheriff Tim Gray was crossing the lot toward her, and the feeling that moved through her, the one she had felt before, in college, in uniform, in every context where a person with authority had looked at her and decided before they knew anything, that feeling arrived and she recognized it and she put it exactly where it belonged. Underneath everything else, underneath the rank, underneath the 15 years, underneath the Trident she had bled for. She was still going to handle this correctly. Tell me where you are watching from, and if you are new here, do well to share and click the subscribe button. What Sonia Collins did in the next 11 minutes is the reason Lone Star County wrote an $11 million check, and why Tim Gray will never wear a badge again. Her name was Sonia Collins, 36 years old, born in Houston, Texas. The daughter of a postal worker and a licensed practical nurse. Two people who had spent their careers showing up, doing the work, and demanding nothing from the world except the dignity that the work had earned. She had grown up in a household where discipline was not a concept, but a practice, where excellence was not celebrated so much as expected, and where the word can't was treated as a first draft that required revision. She had revised it her entire life. She had applied to the United States Naval Academy at 17. She had been accepted. She had graduated with distinction in 2010 with a degree in systems engineering and a commission as an ensign in the United States Navy. She had served 2 deployments, one in the Persian Gulf, one in the Western Pacific, before applying for special operations training. The application alone had been a statement. Women had not been permitted to serve in special operations units until 2016. Sonia had applied in 2017. She had been told by 4 separate people in her chain of command, all men, all well-intentioned, all wrong, that the training was designed for a body type she did not have, and that her application, while admirable, was unlikely to succeed. She had noted their concern. She had applied anyway. EBUD/S, Basic Underwater Demolition/SEAL Training, is among the most physically and psychologically demanding military training programs in existence. The attrition rate across all candidates exceeds 80%. The Hell Week component, a continuous 5.5-day period of near constant physical activity on fewer than 4 hours of sleep total, produces a dropout rate that senior instructors describe as a feature rather than a flaw. Sonia Collins had not dropped out. She had graduated from BUD/S in 2019. She had completed the full SEAL qualification training pipeline. She had received her Trident, the special warfare insignia, in a ceremony that her mother had attended in a new dress, and her father had attended in the suit he wore to funerals, and the births of grandchildren and the events that required him to understand, without being able to fully articulate, that something significant had happened. Something significant had happened. She was now a lieutenant commander, 04, with 15 years of service, 2 combat deployments, a Joint Service Commendation Medal, a Navy Achievement Medal, and a Meritorious Service Medal. The decorations on her chest were not decorative. They were documentation, a record of what she had done and where she had been and what she had been asked to do and had done anyway. She was wearing all of it on the afternoon of September 14th when she stopped at the Ridgeline 66 on Highway 9 in Crestwood, Texas, on her way home from a commissioning ceremony at Naval Air Station Joint Reserve Base Fort Worth. Sheriff Tim Gray pulled in behind her 4 minutes later. Tim Gray had been the sheriff of Lone Star County for 16 years, was 54 years old. He had been born in Crestwood, raised in Crestwood, attended Crestwood High School, and joined the Lone Star County Sheriff's Department at 22 after 2 years of community college. He had worked a patrol for 8 years, made sergeant, and won his first election for sheriff at 38 on a platform of getting back to basics and restoring order to a county he had described in his campaign literature as being under threat from outside influences. He had won 4 elections since, each by a comfortable margin. His personnel file showed 4 prior complaints filed against him in 16 years. All 4 had been reviewed by the department's internal affairs process, a process that, in Lone Star County, consisted of Gray reviewing complaints against himself and determining their outcome. So all 4 had been closed. 2 had involved black motorists stopped on Highway 9. 1 had involved a Latino family whose vehicle had been searched without consent outside a grocery store. 1 had involved a black business owner questioned at length about the legitimacy of his commercial vehicle. All 4 complaints described the same behavior: a stop without clear legal basis, a demand for documentation that exceeded standard protocol, language that made the racial basis for the stop explicit rather than implied. All 4 had been closed with the same notation: officer exercised appropriate patrol discretion. Gray had read that notation on his own complaints and signed the closure documents himself. On the afternoon of September 14th, Gray was on patrol on Highway 9. His highway, as he thought of it, in the stretch of road he had been driving for 32 years, when he saw the black Escalade pull into the Ridgeline 66. New temporary tags, black woman behind the wheel, expensive vehicle. His patrol car turned into the lot before he had formed a complete thought. He positioned it behind the Escalade. He activated his lights. He had done this before, many times, on this highway, at this gas station, with this particular combination of factors producing this particular response in him before any legal analysis had occurred. He had never once been held accountable for it. He was about to be. Sonia watched Gray cross the lot toward her. She assessed him the way she assessed everything, completely, immediately, without letting the assessment show on her face, hand resting near his weapon. Up body language forward and aggressive before he had covered half the distance. The expression of a man who had already decided what was happening and was approaching to confirm it. She did not move from the pump. She kept one hand on the fuel nozzle and turned to face him. She waited. Gray reached her. He looked at her. He looked at the uniform, the decorations, the rank insignia, the white officer's cap. And he processed none of it. What he processed was what he had processed from the moment he saw the Escalade pull in. The vehicle and the driver and the calculation his brain had been running before he even got out of his patrol car. He said, "License and registration," and explained to me how someone like you affords a brand new Escalade. Someone like you, not someone your age, not someone with temporary tags, someone like you. Sonia said, "The same way anyone does, Sheriff. I work for a living." He said, "Work doing what exactly?" He said, "Rides like this don't come from honest work in his experience." She said, "Sheriff, I am standing in front of you in a United States Navy uniform. Look at what is on my chest." He looked at the uniform. The decorations, the ribbons, the medals, the service commendations arranged with the precision of someone who had earned each one in a specific place, at a specific time, for a specific thing. He looked at the trident on her chest, the special warfare insignia, the one that a person earns by surviving something most people cannot complete. He looked at the white officer's cap. He looked at the rank insignia on her collar. Then he said, "Anyone can buy a uniform online." Sonia looked at him for one full beat of silence. She said, "Is that really the hill you want to die on?" He did not answer. She said, "Your experience is about to get a lot more expensive, Sheriff." Rosa Vega, 42 years old, at the pump across from Sonia, phone already out since the moment Gray's lights had activated, kept her phone steady. She had been recording for 6 minutes. She had captured Gray's approach, his positioning, the lights, the walk across the lot, every word. Gray's own body cam had captured all of it too. Sonia looked at the body cam on Gray's chest, the red light, still recording. She pulled out her phone. Captain Gary Castro picked up on the first ring. He was the Navy's Fort Worth liaison officer, the person whose job was to handle exactly the kind of situation that was unfolding at a gas station on Highway 9 at 4:47 on a Tuesday afternoon. He was 44 years old. He had been in the Navy for 22 years. He had known Sonia Collins for 6 of them. Sonia spoke for 40 seconds. She told him her location. She told him what had happened. She told him Gray had questioned her ability to afford the Escalade, had demanded an explanation for her means, and was currently standing in front of her after seeing her military credentials and appearing to consider his next move. Castro said, "I'm calling the base commander. Do not end the call." He did not end the call. He put Sonia on hold and called the base commander, a 2-star admiral whose involvement in a gas station stop in Crestwood, Texas, would produce a phone call to the Lone Star County Sheriff's Department that Gray's dispatcher would describe, in her later statement to investigators, as the most unusual call she had received in 11 years. That call came 4 minutes after Castro made it. In those 4 minutes, Gray had continued the confrontation. He had demanded to search the Escalade. Sonia had refused. He had cited what he called reasonable suspicion based on the totality of circumstances. Sonia had asked him to articulate specifically what circumstances. He had said the vehicle and the temporary tags and the fact that she was in this county. The fact that she was in this county. He had said that. Rosa Vega's phone had captured it. Walter Cross, 67 years old, retired Army veteran who had been inside the Ridgeline 66 convenience store buying a coffee when the lights came on outside, had come out at some point during those 4 minutes and taken a position on the pavement near the gas station entrance. He did not say anything. He did not record anything. He stood there in the particular way that veterans stand when they are witnessing something that requires a witness. Upright, visible, present. Chris Davis, 29 years old, 3 years behind the Ridgeline 66 counter, was watching through the glass. She had seen Gray at this station before. She had seen him stop drivers before. She was thinking, as she watched through the window, about the specific fact that she had never seen him stop a white driver in 3 years of working at that station. She would write that down in her statement. 4 minutes after Castro's call, the Lone Star County Sheriff's Department dispatcher received a call from the Public Affairs Office of Naval Air Station, Joint Reserve Base, Fort Worth. The caller identified themselves, stated the name of the commanding officer on whose behalf they were calling, and stated that Lieutenant Commander Sonia Collins, United States Navy Special Operations, was currently being detained without cause at a gas station in Crestwood, and that the commanding officer was requesting immediate confirmation that she was being released. The dispatcher transferred the call to Gray's radio. Gray listened. He said nothing for 11 seconds. Then he said, "Copy that." He lowered his radio. He looked at Sonia. He looked at the uniform. He looked at the decorations. He looked at Rosa Vega's phone pointed directly at him from across the pump island. He looked at Walter Cross standing at the entrance. He looked at the Escalade. Then he said, in the flat and final tone of a man who understands that a situation has collapsed, "You're free to go." Sonia looked at him for one moment. She said, "I know." She got into the Escalade. She started the engine. She drove out of the Ridgeline 66 and onto Highway 9. Gray stood in the parking lot and watched her go. Rosa Vega kept filming until the Escalade was out of sight. Rosa uploaded the footage at 6:14 p.m. the same evening. She had been thinking about it for 90 minutes, sitting in her car in the parking lot of a grocery store 2 miles from the Ridgeline 66, watching the video back on her phone, deciding what to do with 9 minutes of footage that she had not planned to record and that showed a sheriff asking a decorated military officer in full dress uniform how someone like her could afford her own car. She posted it. She wrote one sentence in the caption: Texas sheriff harasses black Navy SEAL at gas station because he couldn't believe she owned her own Escalade. Within 3 hours, the video had 400,000 views. By midnight, it had crossed 2 million. By the following morning, it had been picked up by every major national news outlet, and the sentence, "Rides like this don't come from honest work in my experience," had been replayed on every broadcast in the country. The reaction was not complicated. It was swift, clear, and without ambiguity. The footage showed a uniformed military officer, visibly, unmistakably uniformed, decorated, capped, in the dress blues of the United States Navy, being asked by a county sheriff to explain how she could afford her own vehicle. The footage showed the sheriff looking at her military identification and saying it might be fake. The footage showed the 4-minute period during which he continued the confrontation after the credentials had been produced. There was no angle from which that footage looked like appropriate policing. There was no framing that made it defensible. There was no statement that Lone Star County's communications office could write that would explain what the footage showed. They tried anyway. The statement they released at 11 p.m., the night the video went viral, described the stop as a routine check prompted by temporary tags on a high-value vehicle. It said Sheriff Gray had followed standard protocol. It said the matter was under internal review. The statement made things worse. By the following morning, the 3 elected officials had called for Gray's immediate resignation. The governor's office had called Lone Star County within 48 hours. A call that lasted 7 minutes and whose contents are in the public record because the county attorney's office was on the line and took notes. The call ended with the governor's representative stating that the state would be monitoring the situation closely and that the outcome of the internal review would be a matter of public record. Sonia Collins filed her formal complaint with the Texas Rangers on day 3. Sergeant John Walters was assigned to the case on day 4. Walters was 47 years old, 17 years with the Rangers. She had handled 12 racial profiling investigations in that time, 7 of which had resulted in terminations, 3 in federal referrals, 2 in consent decrees. She had a reputation for precision that made county sheriffs uncomfortable and civil rights attorneys grateful. She pulled Gray's full-stop history on day 6. What she found was not a single incident. It was 16 years of a pattern. Gray had conducted 47 documented stops of Black and Latino drivers on Highway 9 in the preceding 4 years alone. 47 stops. 39 of them produced no citation, no arrest, no finding of any criminal activity, just a stop, a demand for documentation, sometimes a search. 3 of the stops involved vehicle searches that the drivers had explicitly refused consent to, and a release. 39 people who had filed no complaint or had filed complaints that went nowhere or had simply driven away and absorbed what had happened to them and continued their lives because the alternative, fighting a county sheriff in a county where he had won 4 elections, was a cost they could not afford. The 4 prior complaints in Gray's file were the ones that had been filed. They were not the full picture. Walters noted every stop in her report. She cross-referenced the stop data against the citation data. She pulled the search records. She documented the pattern with the particular thoroughness of someone who understood that a pattern documented precisely was a pattern that could not be argued away. She also found something in Gray's personnel file that the internal review had not produced. A memo, written 14 months earlier by Gray's own deputy, Sam Butts, 31 years old, 3 years on the force, to the department's chief administrative officer. The memo described 2 stops Butts had witnessed that he believed lacked legal basis and that had, in his words, left him concerned about the department's stop practices in relation to minority drivers on Highway 9. The memo had been received. It had been filed. It had not been acted on. Sam Butts had written a memo and nothing had happened. John Walters made a copy of the memo and added it to her file. She submitted her report to the Texas Attorney General's office 22 days after the complaint was filed. The report was 48 pages. It documented the stop of Sonia Collins in full. It documented the 47 prior stops. It documented the 4 prior complaints and the self-review process that had closed them. It documented Butts's memo and its fate. The Attorney General's office referred the matter to the Federal Department of Justice. Richard Thomas filed the civil lawsuit the same week. Richard Thomas's complaint was 62 pages, 20 years in civil rights law, 18 federal cases. He had a reputation, among the attorneys who opposed him, for building cases that were so thoroughly documented that the decision to fight them in court was not a legal question, but an ego question. And egos that chose to fight Richard Thomas's cases tended to find out why that was a mistake. The complaint named Tim Gray individually. It named Lone Star County. It named the Lone Star County Sheriff's Department as an institution. 4 causes of action: unlawful detention, racial discrimination, pattern and practice of racially motivated stops, the deliberate indifference, the institutional finding that the department knew, had documentation in its files, and had chosen not to act. The deliberate indifference count was the one that made the county's attorney call Richard Thomas's office within 72 hours of the filing. The call lasted 9 minutes. Richard described it later as entirely unremarkable. The attorney said the county wanted to discuss a resolution. Richard said he would see them in discovery. The attorney said the footage was difficult. Richard said the footage was the easiest part. The attorney said they should talk. Richard said they would talk in the deposition. The deposition of Tim Gray lasted 7 hours and 3 minutes. Richard did not begin with the gas station. He began with the 47 stops. He placed the stop records on the table one at a time. He asked Gray to identify the stated legal basis for each one. Gray provided answers for some. For others, he said he did not recall. For 11 of them, he said the circumstances had warranted attention without being able to specify what the circumstances were. Then Richard placed Rosa Vega's footage on the screen. He played it from the beginning, from the moment Gray's lights activated to the moment Sonia drove away. Full audio. He played it without commentary. He let it run. When it ended, he asked Gray one question. He said, "Sheriff, at what point during that stop did you observe a violation that justified the stop?" Gray said, "The temporary tags." Richard placed the Texas Transportation Code on the table. He opened it to the section governing temporary tags. He asked Gray to identify the provision that authorized a stop based on temporary tags alone, in the absence of an expired registration or an equipment violation. Gray's attorney objected. Richard noted the objection and continued. He placed Butts's memo on the table. He placed the 4 prior complaints on the table. He placed the 47 stop records on the table. He placed the clip, 6 seconds long, pulled from Rosa Vega's footage, in which Gray said, "Rides like this don't come from honest work in my experience." He let the room sit with it. Then he placed Sonia Collins' service record on the table. Every deployment, every decoration, every year, everything she had done and been asked to do and survived. He said, "Sheriff Gray, well, this is the service record of the woman you asked to explain how someone like her could afford her own car." He closed his folder. He said, "I have no further questions." The county's attorney called Richard Thomas the following morning. They settled 11 weeks later. $11 million, structured across Gray individually to the extent his assets allowed, and Lone Star County as the primary obliger. Richard had specifically constructed the complaint to ensure the institution bore the weight because the institution was where the pattern lived. 5 non-financial terms attached to the settlement. First, the Lone Star County Sheriff's Department was required to implement an independent external review process for all complaints of racial profiling. No future complaint would be reviewed internally, and all reviews conducted by an independent panel with full access to personnel files, stop records, and body cam footage. Second, all vehicle stops were required to be documented with specific, articulable, reasonable suspicion recorded before any contact with the driver. The documentation had to be submitted to a supervisor within 24 hours of the stop. Any stop that could not be documented would be flagged for automatic review. Third, while our body cameras were required for all deputies within 60 days. All footage retained for a minimum of 2 years. Fourth, the department was required to issue a public acknowledgement in the Crestwood Courier and on the department's official website that its internal complaint review process had failed to identify a documented pattern of racially motivated stops over a 16-year period, and that this failure had directly harmed residents of Lone Star County. Fifth, Tim Gray was permanently barred from serving in any law enforcement capacity in the state of Texas. Tim Gray was terminated 14 days after Walter's report was submitted. His law enforcement certification was revoked by the Texas Commission on Law Enforcement. At 54 years old, after 16 years as sheriff, his career was over. He appealed once. The appeal was denied. The written decision cited the footage, the 47 stop records, the 4 prior complaints, the self-review process that had closed them, and Butts's memo, the one a deputy had written 14 months earlier, filed away and never acted on. Sam Butts had written it anyway. He had written it knowing nothing would happen, and he had written it because he believed something needed to be on the record. It was on the record. It was in the decision. Sonia Collins distributed the settlement through 4 channels: $2 million to a legal defense fund for military veterans subjected to racial profiling, specifically for Black and Latino veterans whose service records had not protected them the way hers had been expected to protect her. $2 million to the Texas chapter of the ACLU for litigation costs in racial profiling cases involving stops on rural state highways. $1,500,000 to a scholarship fund at Texas Southern University for Black women pursuing careers in military service and federal law enforcement. $1 million to establish a community oversight program in Lone Star County specifically, funding an independent civilian board with authority to review all stops, all searches, and all complaints filed with the Lone Star County Sheriff's Department for the next 10 years. $4,500,000 she retained. She used a portion to pay taxes on the settlement, a portion to renovate her mother's house in Houston, a portion she put away without explanation to anyone. She issued a written statement. It was 3 sentences. I stopped for gas. I was wearing my uniform. What happened next is documented. 47 stops, 16 years. Our 4 complaints that reviewed themselves and closed themselves and produced no consequence and no change and no signal to anyone on that highway that the thing being done to them had been seen and taken seriously and would not be done again. And then a Tuesday afternoon in September, when a woman in full Navy dress uniform, decorations visible, rank visible, Trident visible, pulled into the Ridgeline 66 on Highway 9 and inserted her credit card into the pump. 4 minutes. That is how long it took Tim Gray to cover the distance between 16 years of impunity and the end of everything he had built. 4 minutes from the moment he activated his lights to the moment he said rides like this don't come from honest work. 4 minutes that Rosa Vega recorded from the pump across the island because she recognized what she was watching before Gray's car door had finished opening. She pressed record. She held it steady. And 9 minutes of footage became 62 pages, became a 7-hour deposition, became $11 million, became a certification revocation, became a public acknowledgement that 16 years of a pattern had been documented and ignored. Sonia Collins went back to work the week after the settlement was announced. She is still serving, still lieutenant commander. She still drives the Escalade. She still stops at the Ridgeline 66 on Highway 9 when she needs gas. She has a dash cam now. She installed it the week after the stop. Not because she was afraid, because she understood, had always understood. I had known it in every room where someone looked at her before she spoke and made a calculation, that the difference between what happened to her and what happened to the 39 people who had been stopped on that highway and had driven away without a camera was documentation. They had not had documentation. She had been fortunate enough to have Rosa Vega. Sam Butts wrote a memo 14 months before the stop that described exactly what was happening on Highway 9. He wrote it and filed it, and nothing happened. His memo ended up in the settlement decision. His name is in the public record. He wrote it anyway. File the complaint. Write the memo. Keep the copy. And if you see something that requires a witness, press record and hold it steady. 9 minutes. That is all it took. Subscribe for more cases like this one. And drop your location in the comments. Because Highway 9 is in Texas, but Tim Gray's 47 stops exist on every highway, in every county, in every state where a pattern sits in a file waiting for someone who will not let it stay there. Everywhere.